everyone, and welcome to a presentation on how HR Analytics improves performance. For those watching this presentation on a webinar, feel free to ask questions in the chat window. If you are watching the replay of the presentation on YouTube, feel free to ask questions in the comment section and I'll respond to you as soon as I can. To give you a brief introduction, my name is Tracey Smith and I help companies use data to solve business challenges, inside and outside of HR. I come from a background of mathematics, engineering, supply chain, and HR analytics. Today's presentation will focus on analytics inside HR. Today we'll talk about practical applications for HR analytics, the added challenges associated with studying people. We'll talk about metrics and how to choose them. I'll show you a framework you can use to approach an analytics problem. We'll talk about how to measure fairness, and we'll conclude with HR's role in data protection. To provide you with a real-world example of how people are deriving value from analytics, analytics is actually being used extensively in the transportation industry. They're using it to optimize bus routes, train schedules, courier deliveries, and airline routes. Additionally, technology and analytics are being used for products inside the home. There's something, as an example, called a smart diaper. It has a chip inside the diaper which takes a sample, analyzes it, and sends that data to the cloud. It predicts an infection before you can actually see any physical symptoms in your child. It then sends an alert to your mobile device. Now, in the world of machines, when we want to try and optimize the machine for production, we can actually run experiments and do analytics and determine what are the optimum settings for that machine in order to optimize the performance. When it comes to studying people, I might be able to create a predictive algorithm to optimize some aspect of my employees, but how easy do you think it is to adjust people based on the results of my algorithm? I can't just turn the dials, can I? Because we are dealing with people, it's actually a lot harder to take action on the results of your analytical studies than studies that deal with inanimate objects like machines. Additionally, there's the challenge of putting sensors on people. If I put a sensor on a machine, it rarely objects. When you put a sensor on people, that's a completely different story. As a case study, there was a newspaper company that wanted to determine whether there was an opportunity to reduce office space by replacing dedicated offices with hotel sites. Hotel sites are essentially non-dedicated desks that people can share. They decided to measure how much time reporters spent at their desks, and they installed a sensor underneath the desks. What do you think happened? The employees found the sensors and removed the sensors. And this is kind of a catch-22 people study. If you told the employees that the sensors were being installed, they likely would have behaved differently and you would produce inaccurate results from this type of experiment. If you don't tell them, then discovery of the sensors destroys the trust between employer and employee. So for this type of experiment, they actually couldn't win no matter what. This is something they should think about and ask this question before spending money on an experiment. In this next section, I'd like to talk about the topic of metrics. One of the most popular questions I receive from people new to the topic of analytics is on how to select metrics. Here are a few fundamental rules to help guide you. Rule number 1. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. I think almost everyone is familiar with this concept. It means that if you don't have data, you're probably making decisions based on opinions and gut feel. Rule number 2, if you can't take action on it, why measure it? This means that there is little value in measuring what you can't impact. You'll just be watching a metric go up and down. If you can't take action on the movement of the metric, there's not much point in actually tracking it. Rule number 3 is the rule that most people forget, and it's the one that will get you into the most trouble if you ignore it. People will behave according to the metrics and targets you select. You need to be careful in selecting metrics as they can have unintended consequences, and unintended consequences can become very expensive. Here I will provide a typical example of unintended consequences when rule number 3 is ignored. A popular metric in human resources is time to hire. We like to measure the length of time it takes to hire someone to ensure that we are filling open positions in a timely manner. However, if you set a time to hire metric that is too aggressive, the recruiters in your company that are responsible for finding new hires may accept lower quality candidates in order to meet the hiring goal you set for them. So sometimes you need a second metric to offset the potential unintended consequences of the first. In this case, a metric like quality of hire will do the trick. As an aside, how to measure the quality of hire is very much a customized definition within each company. Inside a company, the definition may even be specific to a job role. For example, how to define the quality of an engineering hire is not necessarily the definition you want for measuring a high-quality accountant. On the screen now is a popular metric for a lot of companies. It's called the revenue per FTE. What it measures is the amount of revenue the company pulls in for every full-time equivalent employee. If you're not familiar with what a full-time equivalent person is, I'll give you an example. An employee who works for you full-time, say 35 to 40 hours per week, is 1 FTE. A part-time person who works about 18 to 20 hours per week, you may call them half of an FTE. So counting FTEs is just a way of summing up a workforce that has full-time and part-time employees into an equivalent full-time workforce. For this particular company, the revenue per FTE metric goes up and down each month with a fairly seasonal pattern. Generally, though, they hover around $25,000 of revenue per month for each FTE. If we look at the red trend line, we do see an ever so slight decrease in this metric. So what can we do with all of this information? This company is actually in the automotive industry. Using publicly available financial reports, I have selected 4 other automotive companies and calculated their revenue per FTE for comparison. These values are shown in the gray box. We can see that our company at $25,000 per FTE compares well to companies 2 and 3. Company 4 produces a higher amount of revenue per FTE. We need to be a bit careful here in comparing to other companies, because if company 4 has a lot of contractors or temporary workers that they have not included in their FTE total, then their revenue per FTE value may be slightly inflated. Let's take a look at another useful business metric, which is the cost of the workforce as a percent of revenue. The red trend line shows us that for this automotive company, the cost of the workforce is increasing faster than revenue is. This means that unless this company is lowering expenses elsewhere, the cost of the workforce is eating into the company's profit. What we can't tell from this metric is why. A deeper investigation into the components that make up the workforce cost needs to occur. Whether you're studying people or machines, the approach to analytics is very similar. You need to start with the business question. What are the business questions you are trying to answer? Or what is the business problem you are trying to solve? If you do this study, will you be able to act on the results? If not, you may be spending money to get no benefit in the end. If we can act on the results of our analytics, what is it worth for us to do so? We want to make sure that we don't incur a cost of $100,000 to do our study to yield a benefit of only $5,000. Analytics within HR studies business questions that are of value to the company throughout the employee lifecycle. For example, how do we optimize recruitment efforts? What drives turnover? How do we forecast demand for future talent? And how do we measure the success of HR programs? These are just a few examples. To help you use analytics to approach a problem, I'll provide you with an analysis framework that you can use. The first thing you want to do is determine the business questions you are trying to answer. You'll hear me say this multiple times. Next, you want to collect and check the data. This means that you want to make sure that your data is fairly accurate before you spend an extensive number of hours analyzing it. Determine which analysis methods should be used for your problem. Conduct the analysis and interpret the information. What do the results actually tell you to do? Finally, present the results in language appropriate to your audience. You will have a very different conversation presenting your results to management versus presenting it to your fellow data analysts. You will quickly find that you will not have enough resources, budget, people to be able to address every single question inside HR that you're trying to answer. So the key to getting value from HR analytics is to focus and prioritize. For example, inside one very large company, they had a question of what key talent were they losing to external companies. Who was their biggest threat in poaching talent? And what we did was we collected data for about 6 months on people exiting the company, and then we developed a dashboard to view competitive terminations. It became very clear that the dashboard revealed several key job categories and experience levels being targeted. HR could then run focus groups and surveys with the identified targeted roles to try and address the turnover issue in that job category. So instead of trying to solve turnover everywhere in the company, because again, this very large global company, they managed to pinpoint and focus and prioritize where they needed to address turnover first. I'd now like to introduce you to the topic of diversity analytics. This is something that has become very popular across the globe within recent years. You'll see it a lot in the news. Reporters and governments, they're well-intentioned with the articles that they write, but when I read these, it's very clear that they do not understand what diversity metrics are actually measuring, and therefore they tend to publish incorrect conclusions in the news. So it's now become the responsibility of corporations to perform proper diversity analytics to explain these public misinterpretations. So when a metric was released called the gender pay gap, it actually confused a lot of people. The gender pay gap does not measure gender pay equity. Equity means that there is equal pay within a job role that men and women are both performing. It means that men and women are being promoted fairly, they're being hired fairly, and we see them leaving the company in roughly the same proportions as our representative of the actual workforce population. The pay gap metric, which was released, basically just has you publish what the median, which is the middle value, the median pay value for men and the median pay value for women. More than this metric is needed to actually assess the diversity within a company. You can have a very large pay gap metric and not actually have a diversity issue. To give you a couple case studies in diversity analytics, as a first example, there was a global technology company that was struggling to increase the diversity of its workforce for several years. We did a data analysis and created predictive models for their diversity. That allowed them to play the what-if game on the parameters of hiring and retention to see how that would actually impact the diversity of their workforce. We created a real-time dashboard to monitor the progress so they could see it every day. And the end result was it allowed them to make better decisions, and the gender diversity targets were actually moving about 10 times faster than they were prior to this study. As a second example, a global tablet company had a 25% gender pay gap metric. So when you see this number, it actually looks quite bad, but in reality, it turned out not to be. We did a statistical analysis of the gender fairness in hiring, performance reviews, and compensation. And the result was that the salary gap was actually not related to gender. A stronger predictor of the salary gap was actually whether somebody chose to be in a technical or non-technical field. So this report was actually fully disclosed by the CEO of the company to employees and the public. So when we want to test for fairness, it isn't always gender that we're looking at. So there could be other factors that you want to look at. We want to ensure fairness across race, color, religion, sex, age groups, veteran status, physical or mental disability. When we test for fairness within HR, we're essentially testing for fairness within processes like hiring, promotions, training and development, internal transfers, RIFs, which are reduction in force or layoffs or redundancies, performance appraisals, and we want balanced terminations. So in this next section, I'm actually going to show you a method to calculate fairness or test for fairness without actually doing any hard statistical work. Adverse impact is a phrase that refers to employment practices that appear neutral but have a discriminatory effect on a protected group. Now, what is a protected group? In the USA, there are federally defined groups that I've listed over on the right-hand side. If you're watching this video from outside the US, you'll have to look up what it actually is for your own country. So these are the various groups that when we test for fairness or a lack of fairness, we're going to actually test across these various group types. So while we say that we're going to test fairness across a group, we have to test inside a process. So the process that we test inside HR might be hiring, promotions, opportunities for training and development, opportunities for internal transfer, RIFs or reduction in force, and performance appraisals. So to put the two pieces together, we are essentially testing the fairness of a process across a group. And on the next slide, I'll give you a specific example. So in this example, I'm going to show you how to use the 4/5 rule or 80% rule to test for fairness. There's also the opportunity to use statistical tests to test for fairness, but we won't discuss that in this presentation. So in this example, suppose we have 80 applicants that were white and 40 applicants that were Hispanic. We hired 48 white employees. We hired 12 Hispanic employees. We calculate something first called the selection rate. So since we selected 48 out of 80 white employees, the selection rate is 48 divided by 80, which is 0.6. Similarly, for the Hispanic group, we hired 12 out of 40 applicants, which gives us a selection rate of 0.3. What we've done so far are the first two steps in the 4/5 rule. We've decided on the factor to test, which was ethnicity, and we have calculated the selection rate for each group. Next, we need to know which group has the highest selection rate. And then we want to calculate the impact ratios, which I'll show you in a second. And then we test to see whether any of the impact ratios are less than 0.8. If it's less than 0.8, this test points towards a bias across the group that we test. So in this example, it would be a bias against a certain ethnicity. So to continue with our example, we take a look and see which is the highest selection rate. 0.6 is our highest. So then to calculate the impact ratio for the Hispanic group, we take the selection rate, 0.3, divide it by the highest selection rate, which is 0.6, and we get a ratio that is actually less than 0.8. So in this specific example, because it is less than 0.8, it points toward a potential bias against an ethnicity. Now, we really didn't do any hard math to be able to do this, so we can use the 4/5 rule as a guide to test for fairness in our HR processes. Now, while the application of the 4/5 rule gets us away from doing statistics, hard math, it is subject to sampling errors, especially with small sample size and selection ratio. So in our particular example, if our data set had less than 50 or fewer hire records or hires in each group, it can incorrectly indicate adverse impact 20% of the time. So I also recommend to companies to do the statistical test as well, because you'll have two methods and each of those methods kind of has its benefit and has drawbacks. But the 4/5 rule is actually a rule of thumb that is so long established that it is still used inside the courts. The second method I mentioned is a statistical test. So you can actually run a chi-square test to determine whether the results in reality are close enough to the results you would expect that we can conclude that there is no bias. When the expected drifts far enough away from the real results, then the statistical test will indicate a bias for you. To give you a few more analytical applications, and this is using mostly statistical testing, but you can answer questions like, did men and women get promoted at the same rate? Are men and women paid fairly? Did men and women answer our engagement survey questions the same way? How many times will men and women apply internally before they then decide to leave the company? These questions can all be answered with data analytics. Now, sometimes analytics can prove something that was a little bit counterintuitive. As an example, a company rotated its best performers into international assignments. It's very expensive, but it is something that a lot of the Fortune 500 do. When they analyzed the data, they found that attrition in these roles actually increased by 12%. And they noticed that the odds of getting promoted from these roles actually decreased by 18%. So while the company was spending a great deal of money on the international assignments program, the results were actually not the results that they were anticipating. To give you another real-world example, there was a healthcare company experiencing financial challenges, and they needed to reduce their nursing headcount. The company's union agreement required that the last employees hired would have to be the first to be let go. They did some calculations and determined that the cost of this RIF, reduction in force, was going to be about $1.5 million. There was a sunk cost of hiring newly acquired nurses as well. They decided to do a prediction of upcoming retirements in the nursing job category. The result of their analysis showed that upcoming retirements would reduce the headcount enough that downsizing wouldn't be necessary. The value in this calculation? They managed to obtain $400,000 in cost savings, and they maintained a strong employer brand by avoiding a public RIF. Predicting turnover is a popular topic in the HR analytics field. Without getting too mathematical, essentially this type of study divides the employee population into a group that stays and a group that goes. Then we hypothesize factors that we think may influence an employee's decision as to whether they stay with the company or leave. Analytics can determine whether any of these hypothesized factors show a mathematical relationship in determining whether someone is likely to leave your company. In a similar way, the same type of mathematics can be applied to studying worker safety. We hypothesize the conditions under which safety incidents have occurred. Was it related to training? Was it related to the length of time since someone's been trained? Is it related to the shift that somebody's working, the day of the week, the external conditions? In this way, we can determine the relationships between those factors and the number of safety incidents that have happened. This allows us to potentially make decisions to reduce the number of safety incidents in the future. This actually relates to a cost savings for the company in fewer fines, lower medical costs, and lower legal costs. So whether we're studying worker safety, recruitment, hiring, promotions, diversity, or terminations, it's the actions that you take based on the analytics that yield value in the field of HR analytics. This value may be in terms of increased worker satisfaction, increased productivity, and ultimately cost savings for the company. There's a lower cost of turnover, potentially reduced cost of safety fines, and reduced legal costs. The final topic I wanted to cover is in relation to data protection and HR's responsibility in that area. The trends in data protection come in two categories: data protection for individual data and data transparency, which aims to make public company data as a whole, i.e. the release of summarized data, not individual data. I'll cover a few of the regulations out there, but keep in mind that new regulations are appearing rapidly. The GDPR went into effect in 2018. It was released by the EU, but it impacts far more than just the EU because it extends to those that do business with the EU. Since every global company likely does business with the EU, instead of having different data protection levels in different countries, most companies decided that it was easier to adopt the details of this regulation globally rather than setting data privacy to different levels in each country. The GDPR requires a quick release of data breach notifications and has additional regulations related to data governance and transparency. Under the GDPR, an employee has the right to be forgotten from your HR systems. They have the right to be removed from your email list as well, which is not the same thing as unsubscribing. Under GDPR, you may also be required to assign data privacy officers. In 2020, we saw the addition of the California Consumer Privacy Act. This grants California residents a broad range of European GDPR-like privacy rights, and I think you can expect to see more states follow this example in the near future. All companies have a certain amount of data protection processes in place, which relate to restricting access to systems and the ability to download data from a system or downloading sensitive fields in a system. But do you know the number one way that sensitive information is released by a company? It's usually by an employee and usually accidentally. For those that do have access to download data from an HR system, sometimes releasing private employee data is as simple as typing the wrong email address when sending that data file to a colleague. To minimize this from happening, it's best to never email data files and instead store them in an access-restricted location like a SharePoint or a shared drive that only authorized people will be able to log into. Before I wrap up this presentation, I wanted to show you the realistic state of HR systems. It's not unusual for large companies to have multiple HR systems that don't talk to each other. We're seeing more and more consolidation of these systems, but in the meantime, most companies have set up their own methods to extract data from multiple systems in order to proceed with certain HR analytics projects. While I'm speaking about HR systems here, since I also perform analytics in other functional areas, I can tell you that this situation is not unique to HR, and it does occur elsewhere in the company as well. I will leave you with just a few takeaways as I wrap up. If you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide, you can do a lot of analysis and generate value. You don't have to be a statistics expert. You can always find one when you need one. HR plays and will continue to play a significant role in data privacy and protection. And finally, remember that the key to success in HR analytics is in establishing focus and prioritization. Use your resources wisely because they will always be limited. If you'd like to learn more, I have several courses on the udemy.com platform where you can perform some hands-on analytics.